afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the first 2024 Photo ID Project volunteer training. So thank you for being here. My name is Sarah Ruiz. I use she, her pronouns. I am the executive director of the Ashray Foundation. And I will pause here, Betsy Miller, to let you introduce yourself.
All right. Hi, I'm Betsy Miller, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am the project coordinator at the North City Photo ID Project.
Great. So the reason that we are here today, mute all of the things here. The reason that we are here today is to talk about photo IDs, to talk about why they're important, what are the barriers that we're seeing specifically in Missouri, and what are we doing about it. And one of the things that we're going to zoom in on is, of course, the North City Photo ID Project, which the Ashray Foundation has been operating in North St. Louis City since August of 2022. So we will go into the nitty-gritty details. So we're going to start kind of big picture, and then I will take you hyper-focused, and then we will come back out. So try not to get whiplash as we go through this. But the idea here is that you soak it in, let it hit you, but not stress, don't stress about remembering everything. So when you come to volunteer at our program, if you decide to do that after today's training, you will have not only a whole team of people around you to support you, but you'll have everything written down in a binder and all these materials. So there is 0% expectation that you remember all of the nitty-gritty processes of which documents and which papers and all those things. So just take it in, and hopefully today this can be either the start or continuation of your learning around this important issue. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Or come off mute and ask. And if you're watching this with a recording, I will make sure that our email addresses are in the description of the video, and you can certainly reach out by email with any questions or comments. So today we'll go through a little bit briefly, who is the Ashray Foundation? What are we trying to do? We'll talk about photo IDs. We will talk about specific context of photo IDs in Missouri. We will get into the North City Photo ID Project, how it works, who the partners are, and then we'll go into the document processes, focusing on Missouri birth certificates, out-of-state birth certificates, and of course, the coveted Missouri photo ID. And then we'll talk about what you do from here, or what you can do from here. So the Ashray Foundation was founded in 2021, and we began operations in 2022. We were founded by Rabbi Susan Talvey to empower and activate the St. Louis community and eventually partners throughout the state of Missouri to promote economic justice, relieve suffering, and interrupt cycles of poverty. So we kind of do this in three primary ways: through empowerment, activation, and interruption. For me, empowerment looks very much less top down than what I think it can traditionally come across as, is like, I'm not going to bestow a empowerment upon you or wave some magic wand and have you be empowered, but rather help you figure out what is blocking you or preventing you from being your fullest self or living into your values to the fullest ability. So how can I help you see what's blocking you and help you take them away so that you can continue on your journey? Activation sort of then follows from like, well, once we shed that, now what do we do? How does that change the way we move and exist and interact in community? And interruption recognizes that sometimes through that process, there are things working against us that are blocking our values and blocking the vision that we have for Missouri. And so sometimes we're called to also interrupt and stop what is happening and the injustice that's happening around us. Ashray Foundation kind of operates in sort of four big bucket areas: partnership investment, policy and advocacy, community building, and direct assistance. And they look really nice and distinct on this beautiful graphic. But as you probably can imagine, in the real world, these are much more blurred lines in terms of how we are identifying awesome initiatives that are already happening in our community, figuring out ways to build trusting relationships with community members, find out ways to partner with them, amplify, strengthen, and support what's already happening. How do we partner with folks across the state to shift policies and laws that impact the lives of Missourians, and certainly find ways that we can provide direct assistance to communities who are suffering and in pain right now. So as you might imagine, the North City Photo ID project also has fingers in lots of those buckets. So we're going to get into that, and I'm happy to talk to you more about the Oshtray Foundation at another time. And certainly would invite you to look at our website. So, what is the power of an ID? I'm going to start this question and this training with a question to you. So, when was the last time you used your ID? You can come off mute or pop it in the chat. I would love to hear, when did you use it last?
I'm trying to remember, to think. Oh, just to demonstrate my identity for any number of things where I'm asked to, like at the bank.
Okay,
Mhm.
at the bank, great.
Yeah, at the airport.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
The airport. I just had to pick up medicine a couple days ago, and I had to use it to pick up a prescription. I used it to get my son's passport to travel, used it to enroll my son in school. Betsy, anything that you've done recently?
Go to the doctor, get health care.
Yeah. And when I was hired with the Oshtray Foundation, I also had to show my ID in order to get a job here. So these things fall into sort of the big map of what IDs now are needed for. I want to pause for a second, and I will be careful not to go into a big rabbit hole about it, but this isn't how it always used to be. ID policies and laws have shifted drastically in the United States since 2011, 2001, since 9/11, 2001. After that point, we saw both at the federal or national level and then trickling down into state level governments, an increased demand for when you need to show an ID or prove your identity, specifically as it relates to citizenship or belonging in a nation state. And you simultaneously saw an escalation of the restrictions and requirements needed in order to get the ID. So you need it more and more, and it's harder to get it. And so this is, given that, what our reality is and what the folks that we serve have expressed and shared, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. These are kind of the big buckets here. Oftentimes, some of you said, maybe we didn't say it this time, housing. If you have a mortgage or a lease or a rental agreement, you need an ID for that. You need an ID to vote in Missouri now, and a very specific kind of ID. We'll talk about that in a little bit. A lot of folks need it for school, not only for themselves, but sometimes also for their children. A couple of you mentioned checking, cashing checks, or banking. Employment, getting a job, healthcare, medications, and even for a lot of folks, food requires having an ID. So if you're looking for public benefits that can help you get some food supplies, even in sometimes, also during COVID most recently, we've seen emergency food services and shelters requiring an ID in order that folks can access emergency type assistance programs. So all of these things and the implications of having access or not having access to this wide variety of issues and aspects of sort of human life, if you will, are now uniquely tied to whether or not you have this thing that we call a photo ID. However, in Missouri, in the United States, there are a ton of people that are excluded and are unable to have an ID. So when I send these slides out, or if you're watching the recording, you'll access the slides online. Excuse me. This is from a study that was done by I just blanked on the name. It's called the MAP study, and I'm pretty sure it's the Missouri Access Project, I think is what it's called. But I will check that and make sure the link is correct, but I'll make sure it's updated in the notes here. But nearly 30 million adults lack some type of lack a driver's license, which is the most common form of ID in the United States. And additionally, some 18 million adults don't have access to the documents that prove birth or citizenship, which are often necessary to obtain an ID. So we're not talking about like, oh, this is a few people and this affects, some folks who are down on their luck, or that we might like to assign individual blame or responsibility to. This is a widespread problem in the United States. Let me zoom in a little bit here about what it looks like in Missouri. So we will talk about the Missouri State ID Access Coalition later today, but the next couple of slides have some data from a statewide survey that's been used and circulated in a few of the ID access programs across the state. So this is representing what is happening right now in Missouri. Like we said at the beginning, folks need IDs for a multitude of reasons. The number one cited reason is employment, followed by housing, public benefits, checking or banking services, and medical services. You can also see that not too far behind that is voting, education, and things like that. So there's a wide need for these things. And we can also go into the ways that this might follow underlying underlying systems of exclusion. So I'm thinking about all the isms, right? We know that ID injustices disproportionately impact people of color, people living in poverty, people who are have a disability, who are seniors, who are like too old, too young, too right? All of those lines you see sort of exacerbated by this, and then replicated by these systems, right? So if you are already in a group of folks that has been excluded disproportionately from access to jobs or housing, for example, you will see that multiplied in the ID access space. People have expressed what keeps them from getting an ID. Why can't you get an ID? The overwhelming majority of respondents said that money is the issue. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but I'm going to suggest to you that when folks talk about the cost of an ID, we are talking about a little bit more than the acute cost of the ID document itself. We're going to come back to that. But also having the underlying documents. Nearly 60% of the people can't get an ID because they don't have all of the stuff that you need in order to get the ID. And then following close behind that is transportation. And these are big issues in Missouri that we're not trying to solve, and we aren't arguably solving in this one little tiny program, but we are trying to chip away at these things. So when I'm going to jump back to that study that I referenced previously, that will be linked in the slides, people often are caught, the sort of nationwide systems level barriers we are seeing here in Missouri, they fall into 5 big buckets. So we talked a little bit about the burdensome documentation requirements, and I'm really going to make that clear for you by the end of today. The needlessly high financial costs. I want to talk about primary and secondary costs there for a minute. So you have to pay for the document, right? The last time maybe that you got your driver's license, maybe you paid, I think, $25 or $28 for that recently in Missouri. But you also had to pay to get there one way or another. Maybe you had a car, maybe you had some gas in it, maybe you needed to fill it up on your way there or on your way back. Maybe you had to take time off work. Maybe you weren't working because you maybe have a partner that was working and could cover that for you. Maybe you had to miss school or take time off of that. Maybe you had to get a babysitter because God knows I would not want to take my children to wait 3 hours at the DMV. So all of those other costs, what I'm calling loosely like secondary costs, go into what this means. There's also another layer here when you think about sort of generational poverty, that when we are talking about spending what might seem like a small amount of money, let's say $18, give or take, that might not seem like a tremendous amount of money to some of us, but for many others, that looks like an either or. If I get this, then I won't be able to buy food, buy diapers, buy formula, pay part of an electrical bill, like all of those other things. So it's not always like more. These conversations around costs get way more complicated when we sort of get out of our own sense of privilege and our own experience for just a moment. So high financial cost, limited availability of ID services. This has to do with where the offices are. These are the within the Department of Revenue. These are offices of the Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV, or often we would say license offices. There are lots in the state, maybe about 100 and I think just shy of 150 is the total number of offices in the state. But that doesn't mean that they are readily available to everyone wherever you live. And this also, when we go one step further, looks at hours. When are they open? If they're open 9 to 5 and you work 9 to 5, that's a problem. That is a barrier. What about what it takes for you to get there? Some of you know from where our office is to where the closest DMV is, that will take you about 2 hours on a bus and a transfer. So if you're thinking about the waiting and the transfer and or walking, that is a significant drive in time space rather than just, one to next door, or I'm just going to drive over there for 5 minutes. There's also an issue of physical accessibility. A lot of the offices, despite many of us thinking and or knowing that they should be readily accessible to everyone, people regardless of their physical abilities, they're not. And they're not going to be until someone reminds and exercises the rights that we have for access. I was just at the Kings Highway DMV last year and renewing and changing my own ID. And I watched an elderly man bring in his own folding chair to wait in line because there were no longer chairs since COVID. The chairs that were in the waiting room had been removed. Maybe this was changed in the last year, but when I was there and all of us were waiting in line, that's an accessibility issue. And even if the doorway and the entrance has a ramp and it's the width and all those things, we can think a little bit further about what it means to be inclusive. There's a confusing patchwork of policies that's going to hopefully be made very clear by the end of today, because once we get into what it's like in Missouri, we'll talk a little bit about what it's like in other states, both in terms of IDs and the documents you need to get them, specifically related to birth certificates. They're different. They are not the same. How it is done here is even not the same as how it's done in Joplin sometimes, or Kansas City. Pretty similar, but not identical. And then when you get outside of Missouri, forget it. And every single place is going to have something different. And there are commonalities and some general broad brushstrokes, but that is really confusing to navigate, especially if you're dealing with a multitude of other things that are not, paid and hired or volunteering your time to focus exclusively on understanding this patchwork of policies. And finally, I just want to name discrimination. We know that happens for better or for worse. I don't want to fall into a big argument about good apples or bad apples or systems. It's happening, and that impacts and influences people's access to getting this important ID and everything that comes with it, right? So if you go and you have these experiences and you've had them the last 3 times, maybe you're going to stop going. Maybe you're going to stop participating. Maybe it's going to deter you from going. Maybe it's going to add on to some of the existing underlying issues and stressors and health issues that you're already dealing with. So I don't want to minimize that. It's happening, and it definitely presents a barrier to many people in our community. In Missouri, as you may know, in 2022, the Missouri legislature passed House Bill 1878. This law is one of an unfortunate history of voter suppression in Missouri, voter suppression laws in Missouri. It is not the first photo ID law in Missouri. It, in fact, changes and narrows the kinds of photo IDs to very specific things. So we were already, prior to 2022, a photo ID to vote state. Now we are a more restricted kind of photo ID in order to vote state. So there's a lot of provisions in 1878, and I'm not the attorney, not an attorney, and so I'm going to give you some big chunks here, and would encourage you to look at the guide that's linked in this slide and will be in the follow-up notes from Missouri Voter Protection. There's some big chunks here about voter registration and absentee voting. I'm going to skip over those right now because we'll talk about them in a minute, but also related to photo ID. The big piece here is that it removed a lot of the previously accepted forms of ID. It took those off the list and said, now you have to have an unexpired Missouri driver's license, an unexpired Missouri non-driver ID, a federally issued passport that is not expired, or a US military ID that is not expired. That's it. That's the list of documents. So the voter ID card that used to be sent to you, the voter registration card that maybe is still sent to you that you could historically use, can't use that anymore. Maybe you have an out-of-state ID that's still valid because you recently relocated to Missouri. Can't use that anymore. Maybe you're a student in Missouri. You can't use that to vote in Missouri. Your utility bill, no longer accepted to vote in Missouri. So it's only a Missouri or federally issued ID that is valid. There's a bunch of other harmful provisions here that we can talk about if we have enough time, but I want to push us forward a little bit because there were some legal challenges to this law, including 2 lawsuits, both that involve the League of Women Voters and the NAACP Missouri Conference. Woo woo. So the first one challenged some of those initial, some of those provisions related to voter registration and absentee solicitation provisions. So there were parts of 1878 that said things like you cannot be compensated for registering people to vote, but were so vague that ultimately a judge in November said, you know what, these provisions, these parts of the law can't go into effect anymore, and block them because some of them were so impermissibly vague. I think that was his language. Because what if you're a student group that is doing voter registration on campus and your student group leader person gave you water and pizza while you were registering people to vote? Is that compensation? It was unclear. What if I, as an employee of ASHRAE, registered someone to vote? I'm not necessarily being explicitly paid to register people to vote, but if I'm doing it within the context of my day-to-day job, is ASHRAE compensating me for that? And is ASHRAE liable? Or am I liable if I take the payment or if they give the payment, right? So it led to all of these questions. One of the other pieces that was challenged and thrown out by the injunction was about registering to register people to vote. So there was this whole thing called register solicitor. You have to register yourself online if you're going to register like 10 people or more in the state of Missouri. And that the judge agreed that violated the right to sort of core political speech, and so that was blocked as well. However, the need to present Missouri or federally issued ID has remained and was not blocked by that lawsuit. Cue lawsuit number 2. This lawsuit is still pending, and this is challenging the photo ID provisions of this law as violating the fundamental right to vote and equal protection under the Missouri Constitution. So I'm going to pause for a minute here and show you a couple of videos. Betsy, will you give me a thumbs up if you can hear this when it gets going?
As the trial against Missouri's voter ID requirement continues, experts and witnesses spoke before a judge today about the effects of this law.
ABC 17's Hannah Falcon joins us live from the Cole County Courthouse after going to the trial. And Hannah, the lawyers fighting this law say it's stopping some voters.
Yes, Morgan, Megan, that trial is just starting to wrap up for the day. It's been going all day. Started at 9 a.m. this morning. They've been talking all day, and they are not done. But today's arguments focused on whether voter IDs are necessary, while those against this photo ID law say that voter fraud is not common here in Missouri. The state says that voter fraud is very likely and that this photo ID law could prevent it.
We're confident that upon the conclusion of this evidence, the court will see clearly that this law does not address any valid, much less compelling government interest.
The Missouri NAACP and League of Women Voters, represented by lawyers from the ACLU of Missouri, are challenging Missouri's voter ID requirement. The suit claims the law, passed in 2022, creates barriers for voters, like Boone County resident Renee Powell, who testified this afternoon.
Epilepsy and other disabilities make it impossible for her to access the local DMV, and she can no longer vote using her expired state ID, something that was eligible before.
Attorney General Andrew Bailey's office argues no one has been turned away from the polls due to the law. In a statement, Bailey tells me, quote, "I will never stop fighting for the integrity of our elections," end quote. Throughout the 4-day trial, 10 witnesses and experts are going to be called on to testify. This morning, the ACLU used testimony from Lorraine Minetti, the nation's leading expert on voter fraud, to try to illustrate that the photo ID requirement is not preventing fraud in Missouri.
It's not like this was open season. There were already rules in place. There's already criminal penalties involved. There are already professionals running elections whose job it is to prevent fraud.
And that trial will pick up again right here at the Cole County Court tomorrow morning. Reporting live in Jefferson City, I'm Hannah Falcon, ABC 17 News.
Thank you, Hannah. This same law was challenged in a lawsuit last year, but dismissed for not having enough evidence.
One
As the
more
trial
here
against
for you to
Missouri's vote-
hear from another voice here, from Rod Chappell, who is the president of the NAACP of Missouri.
These attempts to allow Jim Crow to intercede and divest people of constitutional rights. It's not fair. It's not right. We understand that the overall effect is simply just to wear us down. We've brought in professors from across the United States, the top researchers on the area. And there's a decision that House Bill 1878 doesn't even do what they said it will do. But that's what we knew from the day that it was introduced as a bill into the Missouri legislature, and that's what we know now. I can tell you what else we know is that being here in the streets, in these communities, in our churches and in our homes, that people are losing out on their ability to participate in this society. And it's happening on the basis of color, it's happening on the basis of disability and sex, and all the things that have been used to divide us coming up to today. We can do so much better in Missouri, a place where the travel advisory still tells us that people are not safe simply because of the way that God made them. We have got to change that and do something better, and together we can. The NAACP with the League of Women Voters, through the power brought by lawyers through the ACLU and the Missouri Voters Protection Coalition, has today set the tone, allowing everyone to understand that our nation is a place that Missouri will not be forgotten, that we are not some hinterland, and that we can actually stand up and conduct ourselves like we are a democracy. And that's what we stand for. Core democratic values, equality and justice for everyone. These attempts to allow Jim Crow.
There we go. So, thanks for joining us, Sylvia. Glad you could hop on here. Just wanted to pause for a moment and remind you that this is being recorded, and I think I'm doing it in a way that won't show your faces, but if you're worried about being somehow seen on the recording, just go ahead and turn your camera off. Please feel free to pop off mute or put any questions in the chat as we go along. So, I am really excited that myself, along with Christine Dragonette, a colleague who runs the longest standing ID access program in the state of Missouri, were invited to testify at the trial in November, which is still ongoing. And I will say more things about that, but if I keep talking about it now, I'm not going to stop for a while because I will get more fired up than I usually am. So I think that in Missouri, there have been a handful of inadequate responses from the state of Missouri to these current and longer standing challenges about the barriers to ID access in the state. One of the biggest things, and we talked about it in the trial and even in my specific personal testimony, is related to the state's Go Vote Missouri program. This used to be called the Show It to Vote program, but was rebranded after 1878, now called Go Vote Missouri, which has sort of two entry points. You can either access this program directly through the Secretary of State, or you can access this through the DMV, a local DMV office. But basically this program says every eligible Missouri voter can obtain one free non-driver ID per lifetime for the purposes of voting. It's the same ID that you would pay for, so it's not like a separate special ID, it's the same thing, but you get it once per lifetime for free. However, there is a gross lack of oversight and significant implementation failures at DMV offices. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But there's also inconsistencies with regard to when you are eligible to get a free ID to vote. And Betsy, I think maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later, but for example, if you have a valid ID on file with the DMV, so let's say you got your ID, it's good for 6 years, and sometime during those 6 years it was lost or stolen, you're not eligible for a free ID anymore because you already have one, even though you don't actually possess it. So I think I'm going to talk about some more things about this because it's also not being implemented universally throughout the state. And I would almost say about half of the DMV offices in the state of Missouri just like aren't participating in this program. They either know about it and are choosing not to, or they don't even know about it. And that's a big problem. There's also, you will hear from the Secretary of State that everyone in Missouri who's eligible to vote can vote because they can always cast a provisional ballot. And I have a lot of thoughts about provisional ballots, but we'll leave those on the side. But the point is that that's inadequate. That's not honoring your right to vote, even though everything else, like keeping all things else equal, that's not good enough. I also think there has been poor and non-existent communication or community education about the changes that 1878 has brought and about the Go Vote Missouri program and the free ID to vote. It even came up in trial when the state's attorney said, well, Miss Ruiz, the state of Missouri spent $100,000 to roll out this program and tell people about the changes of 1878. And are you saying that you don't think that's sufficient? And I said, well, no, absolutely not. My one little podunk program spent $30,000 in 1 year. College Church spends over $70,000 in document costs alone, not talking about staff costs or any of the other costs, about in one little tiny city in Missouri. And you're saying you spent $100K across and more than half your offices aren't even doing it? Like, I don't care how much you spend, it's not working. Like that's not enough. There's also a fundamental lack of understanding of people's lived reality in Missouri. And that was made so abundantly clear to me at the trial that folks in Jefferson City are so removed from how people live day-to-day lives in Missouri. When the state's attorney said to me, but Miss Ruiz, haven't you ever accessed internet at a Starbucks? And couldn't your guests just go access the free ID to vote program on their phone, on the internet, at their local Starbucks? Needless to say, I responded to explain that A, there isn't a Starbucks in the zip code where I work. B, people that I see don't spend their money at Starbucks, and see that that's not the point. Like, this is not what this is about. And then forget about the things about transportation. Oh, it's only a 10-minute drive. Well, it's a 10-minute drive if you're driving your own car, but what about everything? I digress. I don't have feelings about this at all. So the other thing here is that there was a potential sort of promise that was made during this ongoing trial in November after our testimony, and a couple other folks testified the following day. The state's attorney kind of said, well, the DMV the Department of Revenue has decided that they will do free IDs for renewals as well. So it's that sort of once per lifetime clause, maybe they're going to throw out. However, it hasn't happened yet. We had a meeting with the Department of Revenue earlier this month, and they think that it will be rolled out in February, that will be the case, but it's not there yet. And they made it very clear that it's only for renewals, so not for replacement or duplicate IDs. But if you've had a free ID to vote and now that ID is going to expire and you're ready to renew it, that you could be eligible to get a free one again, as long as you weren't getting a duplicate or replacement one. My same critique holds true that if over half your offices aren't doing the free ID in the first place, I don't really care how many times you do it. You got to actually do it for it to matter in the lives of everyday Missourians. So in all of this context, ASHRAE as a new organization was in lots of conversations trying to figure out what's our role? How do we respond to this? What is needed? How do we make a difference? And it was through those conversations and some other exploration of models that we encountered St. Francis Xavier College Church's outreach program. This program is the longest standing ID access program in the state of Missouri, started in 1993. It's run out of the Jesuit parish that is on the campus of St. Louis University in Midtown St. Louis. They have been seeing a historically high demand, serving between 50 to 70 people every week in their one-day program, and offer over 50,000. I'm pretty sure last year they topped 60,000 in direct ID assistance costs. Again, forgetting the rest of the costs here in terms of staff and admin and so on and so forth, but just in document cost. We were also visiting spaces sort of in hub community development center models. We were at the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation hub in North St. Louis City and learned that College Church had done an offsite program there in 2021. And they really, it had like good start, but there wasn't capacity to sustain it. College Church couldn't run it offsite, and the hub didn't have the capacity to run it either. And so we kind of said, wait, so like you have the model and you have the people, you just need volunteers to do it. Like if we did that, do you think that would be a good thing? Like, would it meet a need? And here we are, still doing this program. So that is when we reimagined what ID access could look like in North City and tried to connect the gap between these community needs and existing resources. So Betsy, I'm going to pass to you to outline the project goals here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So this is where we get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty and a little bit more into what volunteers do on a I was gonna say daily basis, on a Thursday basis when they're working with guests. And so we provide both logistical and financial assistance to our guests to obtain their IDs. And that could be Missouri birth certificate, out-of-state birth certificate, or the Missouri photo, non-driver photo ID. And so as we think about guests coming in, we greet them. We have a nice hospitality area where they can grab a snack, get something to drink. In the wintertime, we've been stocking a few socks and hats and hygiene kind of packets, and just because we know the weather can be really, really tough this time of year too. So volunteers work with our guests to understand what our guests need and then work through the process. And we'll see a little bit about what that process looks like in just a few minutes. There are times where our volunteers do get kind of creative when obtaining some documentation. So a lot of times, but not always, this comes into play with birth certificates, and particularly out-of-state birth certificates. Sometimes also with Social Security cards, which we provide a little bit of support for, but not a whole lot of support for that. So we can get very creative. You see a lot of interaction between the volunteers because one volunteer might have experienced a situation that the other volunteer now is going through. So there's a lot of information sharing there too. So we work through the process with the guest. We provide clear next steps for them to get the documents for voting, for advocacy, so they know exactly where they need to go to get their documents, what they need to do. They know what we're doing on our end, particularly if it's an out-of-state birth certificate kind of issue. We also provide the financial assistance. Sarah already talked a little bit about the Go Vote Missouri, so we do talk about that with our guests, and some do take advantage of that. We also cover the cost of one birth certificate and one photo ID per person per year. And we also provide a couple of bus tickets for folks. So we cover bus fares. Obviously, we don't cover the cost when they coming to us, but if they can get to us, we'll help cover the cost for them going to a couple of different offices that they need to go to. And when we do this, we're doing all of this in respecting each individual's situation and providing an environment where they are being shown some dignity, and we're preserving that dignity. So we're meeting our guests where they are in the situation that they're in to help them get the documents that they need. Go on. Yep. All right. Into the details. And I do not expect anybody to remember all of this. We do have, I think Sarah mentioned this earlier, we have a binder that all of our volunteers use when they're working with our guests, and has some flow charts, and you'll see a sample of that in just a minute here. But everything, just about everything, 98% of what a volunteer needs will be in that binder. Okay, well, let me do, okay. Go ahead. Okay, so we talk about Missouri birth certificates. I haven't really done a calculation. Maybe Sarah, you probably know the data better than me on this one, but we do see a lot, obviously, of Missouri birth certificates. We see a fair amount of Illinois as well. We'll get to out of state too, but most of the time we're working with, probably most of the time, we're working with Missouri birth certificates. There are two offices that our guests can go to, one in City Hall and one in the county, closer to the airport, I believe, in Berkeley. Most of our folks will go to the office in City Hall. We have a pretty good working relationship with them. And I have found personally that folks getting Missouri birth certificates, it works pretty smoothly. This is probably maybe the smoothest part of the process if somebody's coming in needing a Missouri birth certificate. So to get a birth certificate in Missouri, and really just about any state, right, you have to have some sort of proof of identity. So you have a copy of a photo ID, or a guest has a copy of a photo ID or a picture of it, great, works, perfect. If not, in the state of Missouri, you need 2 documents with the applicant's name on it. And we have found it really could be just about anything. So mail, insurance card, court documents, release papers from a hospital. So really, really anything will work to get the Missouri birth certificate. Most of their guests will go in person to one of the Vital Records offices. We can do it by mail, and if so, we notarize that for them and send in the application as well as the payment. If folks are going in person, they will walk out with a check made out to the respective Vital Records office to cover the cost of the Missouri birth certificate. And they will get their birth certificate that day. They'll walk in, if they're walking in, they'll walk in, give them the application, give them the payment, and walk out with their birth certificate. And I don't know how unique Missouri is in this, but it is advantageous to us that if somebody who's born in Missouri can go anywhere in the state of Missouri to get their birth certificate. So they don't have to go back to the particular county they were born in. So somebody that was born in over in Kansas City area in the Missouri side can be here in St. Louis and go down to St. Louis City Hall and get their birth certificate same day. Not all states are like that. All right, here's our handy dandy flow chart. I love these flow charts. And I don't expect that you'll need to read through all of this right now, but just know that flow charts like this are available for every process that we work through. But as you can see, it's a handy dandy guide to working with our guests, because the questions are right here, right? Do you have a current state or photo ID? Yes or no? Okay, well, if not, do you have these 2 documents? Yes or no? And I think it is important to note that we can, as our organization, provide one of those documents. We have what we call a verification letter, and that serves as one of the documents for our guests. So usually we can work with our guests to find another document plus ours if they don't have their photo ID, and then they are good to go. Rarely, but we do sometimes jump into Vital Check, which is an online system. We do that more, I think, with out of state than we do with Missouri. It's kind of our last resort, one, because it costs more, but it's kind of our last resort, but it is an option if we need to pursue it. Okay. All right, so Missouri birth certificate, we work with our guests to complete the application. We make sure that they have their identification documents, whether that's their photo ID or the 2 things with their name on it. Make sure that they have their payment, and make sure that they're clear on which office they are going to. We give them a nice, I think it's a nice next step document, because this is a lot of information for people, and sometimes people are struggling with what the right process is and where they have to go first and what they have to provide. And so we put it together in a nice next step document for them that they can refer back to. So once they leave our office, if they've forgotten what one of our volunteers said, it's right there written out for them. All right, and who can apply for a Missouri birth certificate? So obviously you can as yourself, right? But then also immediate family members, official representatives, other agents, the parent listed on the birth certificate, guardian, foster parents, step parents. People have to be in the direct line of descendants, I think is the right term, to be able to apply for a birth certificate for somebody else. So aunts, uncles, cousins can't, but immediate family members certainly can. And that is also different from state to state sometimes. So have to be really clear when we're working with somebody who's out of state on what the rules are, right? And we'll see a little bit more about that.
Betsy, I also just wanted to mention really quickly, because it's come up a couple of times, that in Missouri, if a father is not listed on the birth certificate, he is not entitled to the child's record unless he can demonstrate that he has custody or authorization to apply, which is unique in Missouri. So it just wanted to add that there too.
Yep.
There is a process in the state of Missouri through the Division of Health and Social Services that if you are a homeless youth, that you are entitled to receive a free certified copy of your birth certificate from Missouri. You have to be under age 21. You have to meet this broad definition of homelessness, which basically is summarized by lacking in fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And then you have to have a homeless services provider sort of fill out this form and attest that you are identifying as someone who is unhoused or homeless under this state definition. When you do that, you take this other form, and instead of paying $15, you can obtain the birth certificate for free. I think since we've started, we've only seen like one person through this process.
Yeah.
I want to speak briefly about these 3 other things about corrections and amendments, about legal name change and gender marker changes, and then one more comment about the free ID. Basically, correction affidavits are if there was an error made, like a clerical error is the easiest way to think about it. You can file an affidavit that gets notarized. and mailed into the Department of Revenue. That's different than a name change. So that's like, for example, I just worked with a family and the parents had 2 last names that were being given to the child, and the hospital and vital records only recorded the first of the 2 last names. So that wasn't considered a correction. It required then a legal name change, which means you have to go before the judge, get a court order. There are fees and costs involved with that. Then you have to take the court order and send it in to get your corrected birth certificate. And in this most recent experience, the state came back and said, actually, you have to go back to the judge because the judge did the order wrong and it doesn't have all of the right information. So now we're in the process of going back to the judge to get the right information to get the daughter's birth certificate correct. There is a similar process, and I'm not going to go into it right now. There's a great training available from some of our colleagues about changing your gender marker in Missouri. As you might imagine, that is also not a simple or straightforward process here. And then the last thing I wanted to mention here is that if you are getting your free ID to vote through the state of Missouri, you can go theoretically through the Department of Health and Social Services in Jefferson City and get a free birth certificate if you were born in Missouri, if you tell them that you are getting your free ID to vote and therefore you need your free birth certificate in order to get your free ID to vote. I have yet to see that has actually like come full circle and worked for anyone, but it's on the Secretary of State's website, and he wanted to make sure that I told you that when we were in trial. Next.
Hey, Sarah, there is a question in the chat going back to obtaining a birth certificate as a step parent.
Mhm.
Would the step parent need to take in legal documents to prove that?
Yes. So the short answer is yes, they have to show. So it is not automatic that the step parent has access in Missouri. They have to show that there was a custody agreement, I think, that enables them to do it. So I can pull up an article about that and send you a link in the follow-up email here. Great question.
All right, out-of-state birth certificates. So there is a nice flow chart here, but I will say every state is different. So there's really not one flow chart that can serve for all of the issues that we come into when we're talking about out-of-state birth certificates. And even when we talk about out-of-state birth certificates, sometimes we'll be working at the count, we'll be looking to get a birth certificate from a particular county first, potentially. And if that doesn't pan out, then we might go to the state office. And sometimes the rules are different there, right? So county might require certain types of documentation to prove identity in order to be eligible to receive the birth certificate. And at the state office, they'll have different requirements. So when we get to out of state birth certificates, obviously the first thing is to find out where the individual was born, right? What state, what county, and then it's usually one of us, Sarah or me, that is on the computer looking to find the form so that we can print that out. And then also looking for what are the requirements, what are the documents that are eligible to be used to show identity and eligibility to receive this birth certificate. And again, it's all different. But when we do that, we're gonna have success with that. We're gonna do that. And then we're going to get copies of the documents that are needed by the state. If we're having some challenges, we might look at Vital Check. We will explain to the guests then where we are in the process with the birth certificate and when it's going to be mailed the next day off to the particular office. And then we also will give them some guidance on when it might be back. We know some states take a lot longer than others. I think we had one come in recently that was 8 months it took. There are others. It's not uncommon for us to see some take 3 months. And so we kind of have a sense of at least who the, I would say, regular lengthy offices are, and we can give some guidance there. And again, we'll complete the next steps guide for our guests so they understand, that it's being mailed off and when they might be able to get it back. But folks who are needing a Missouri photo ID, for the most part, can't really do much until they get this birth certificate in. So the person who waited 8 months was waiting 8 months to be able to go get a photo ID. So it obviously does provide some challenges, but we jump through as many of these hoops with our guests to get these out-of-state birth certificates as we can. So some of this I already mentioned. So we usually start local, and a lot of that, according to me, is because that usually takes less time, right? Going to the county usually takes less time than going to the state office. However, sometimes the counties can be a little bit more restrictive. They're usually not, but sometimes they are. And I know we had one that was really challenged a while ago where we really had to go to a relative to apply for the application on the guest's behalf because we just could not meet the stringent documentation requirements that they had in place. Birth certificate, usually 6 to 8 weeks. That's about right. We do have some that come in sooner, and obviously we have some that come in a lot later. If we need to, we'll do some follow-up. We get really, really very good at calling vital records offices and asking questions about what is either acceptable for them or then following up on status and seeing if we can get any updates on whether it's being processed or if it's been mailed. Had one where I called and it had been mailed and the address wasn't right, so it had been returned. So she tracked it down and then sent it back out. That was a big win. I thought for us that she went above and beyond to track that down and find it. So there are times when we're calling up to the vital records, and I will say vast majority of the time they are very helpful. Vast majority of the time we can work with them to figure out what we can provide to meet their documentation. And sometimes what I've done is instead of saying, what documents will you accept? I say, okay, our guest has XYZ. Do any of those count? Right. So we can start to look at what the individual has and see if the office will accept those.
Betsy, I also just want to add here so that it comes out in the recording because there's some good questions in the chat here. The question was about whether or not we have all of the applications printed online, printed in the office or not when we do the clinics. And you just articulated why we don't do that, because we would also have to look at cities and counties and states and then sometimes online. And so there's like all of these options that realistically, if someone says like, oh, I was born in Michigan, the next question we ask is, where in Michigan? And that's where we're going to start the application process. And then we have to figure out, is that a good one? Or should we look at the state and compare which one works? So, so that's sort of like the primary reason. The secondary reason is sometimes the forms get updated. So I did the first time in August of 2022. I printed out all the state applications I thought was so on top of it, and they were all in these folders, and it was like, well, this one's old and we don't use that one anymore. And this one changed, and now we want to look at the locality. So we have it organized digitally online, and usually it's pretty fast for us to pull it up and print one out, but that's why. And then there was a couple questions about who takes the longest, and right now, New York State is the one that takes the longest, and that was the 8-monther that Betsy mentioned. And then I also popped in there that California is also a long one. A relatively simple process, expensive. It costs $34 to get your California birth certificate. And it usually takes 3 to 6 months. So lots of variety there.
But California pretty much is just notarized statement. So like, yes, that makes the process our process a little easier. Not the process once it hits California, I guess, because it does take quite a while.
And for someone who is trying to get a Missouri ID who has never had one or who doesn't have one in their possession anymore, that adds that wait time for when they can get the ID. And we already started today talking about what people need an ID for. So that adds that wait time to in order to access the services that you actually are trying to get to.
Yep.
Thanks, Betsy.
Yep. So out-of-state birth certificates, they do take a little bit more because we are mailing them in. So when our guest leaves, we've got to make sure the application is signed because they do have to sign it. We have to look to see if it needs to be notarized. Some do, some don't. So if it needs to be, we need to make sure that it is. We need to make sure that we have the copies of the supporting documents, whatever those may be. Some states, some counties require that we include a return addressed stamped envelope. So we need to make sure that we have that in there. And as I said before, when in doubt, we just call. Like we call up to Vital Records office to get clarification, to ask questions, to check on status, et cetera, et cetera. So VitalCheck is an option. VitalCheck is an online vendor. It's a third-party vendor, so it may be quicker. It can be useful for clients with limited documentation sometimes, but not always. VitalCheck will use a little bit of a different way to authenticate people through a series of questions like which address, had you lived at, and you get to choose 1 out of 4, or which of these cars was, or which of these, I don't know, relatives or individuals is not one of your relatives. And, you go through that process to authenticate who you are. It's not available for all states. And because it is a third-party vendor, we have to pay the VitalCheck fee plus the fee for the state or the county, whatever that may be, for the birth certificate itself. We do use it, but not very often. All right, photo ID. This also can be a little convoluted at times. There are a lot of requirements for proving different aspects of ourselves, right? So identity, lawful status, residency, and Social Security, and then obviously we have to have the payment. So most common for identity is the birth certificate. Nope, that's okay. Lawful status, again, can use the birth certificate for that. Missouri residency, utility bill, mail, anything that somebody's gotten with their name and address on it in the recent past, we can use for that. And there's also a form DOR 5862 that we can use, and we do use pretty regularly for some of our guests that are experiencing some transition in their housing situation or unhoused at the moment. Social Security, people can recite their Social Security number if they have had a Missouri ID or driver's license in the last 10-ish years or so. And if not, then they have to prove that. So they have to have their Social Security card, or they have to have a W-2 or a 1099 or a pay stub with their full Social Security number on it. So for folks that are getting their, and that's, so if you haven't had a Missouri driver's license or photo ID in the last 10 years, right, you have to go through that process. So somebody that's just moved to the state, doesn't have a birth certificate, doesn't have their Social Security card because they were lost or stolen or what have you, that becomes an issue because you know what you need to get your Social Security card replaced? A birth certificate and a photo ID. So it does become a catch-22. There's actually one of our former guests that left a message shortly before this training. I'm going to call him back after this. That's in that catch-22. So we'll work to see if we can figure that out. So also we work with our guests on making sure that they have everything that they need before they go to the DMV to get their Missouri State ID, including the payment, or if they're going to do their free ID to vote, we'll give them a little bit of additional information about that. And if they need to, how to best advocate for themselves for getting access to what they have the right to have access to. Okay. Oh, you got it. Okay, so again, this is high level flow chart. I think for volunteers, this is very helpful. Again, it helps you ask the questions of the guests and work through this so that you know what the guests need and what you as a volunteer would help them with making sure that they either have or that we can help them get. One of the things with Missouri residency that we do sometimes is if they have recently moved, so they have a permanent address, they've recently moved, they haven't gotten a utility bill yet, they haven't really gotten mail with their name on it yet, we will send them a letter. We'll put something in the mail to them. And when they get it in the next, the few days after that, then they can go into the DMV to get their photo ID. So there are things throughout this process that as a volunteer, that our volunteers then help our guests get in order to, again, get the documentation that they need.
I think you covered some of this, so let me know if you just want me to keep going.
Yeah, no, you can keep going. All right, so in terms of kind of the next steps with the Missouri State IDs, if our guest is not using the free ID to vote, they'll take the payment, their needed documents to a DMV licensing office. Some of our guests would like to have a driver's license or replace a driver's license instead of getting a photo ID, so they can do that. We will still give them the check for $18, but then they will cover the rest of that cost, and they will let them know that before they go to the office. So if they're doing that, they know that they need to have the cash or cashier's check or what have you, credit, debit card with them when they go. Individuals will receive a paper temporary ID at the office, and then they will get their permanent ID card in the mail about 2 weeks later. And that does seem to work pretty smoothly. If we have filled out the 5862 for somebody that is experiencing some transition in their housing or is currently unhoused, it will be mailed to us. So we'll get that within a couple of weeks, and then we will coordinate with that guest to make the transfer of that document. Okay. Oh, here we are.
And I think
do.
Yeah, I already mentioned this. Do you want to keep going?
Yeah, because the one thing that I do want to say is there was a lot of work done to bring this about. And so 3 years of advocacy led by College Church to bring this about. And so this is a big deal. We'd have to go back and again, look at the data, but I would say we're using this maybe a quarter of the time. I mean, it varies from week to week. But we do have a significant portion of our guests who need this and would not be able to get the photo ID because they would not be able to prove a residence, which is required to get the photo ID. So this has really been, I think, a significant enhancement to this process and what we can do to support our guests.
I would also just add very briefly that in our continued meetings with the Department of Revenue, they have emphasized that this is what they consider to be an exception process for proof of residency. So you won't see it. It's like you got to know that it's there in order to use it. They're not going to advertise it. It's not listed in like acceptable documents for proof of residency. If you search homeless on the Department of Revenue website, you will find it, but that's the only place. You have to know that it's there. What is listed on their standard accepted documents is a letter from a homeless service agency, like a shelter, a shelter letter. But that is, even that is limited to people who are receiving services and are staying at a shelter where that shelter can prove their address. So for people who are living in the streets or in a multitude of other situations, that is not an option, and they have to know that this exists, and a nonprofit or a service provider has to be able to fill it out for them. Want to briefly talk about the difference between the real and the non-real ID. The significant difference in our purpose is that the non-real ID requires less documents, right? A real ID comes out of, again, 2001, comes out of the USA Patriot Act. The effective date continues to be delayed. So currently it is scheduled for May of 2025 is the next implementation date. 20 some odd years after 9/11, but that's fine. So the whole point is that Real ID comes out of this like terror narrative and tries to establish a national ID instead of a state ID, but the effective date continues to be delayed. There's no cost difference between the two types of IDs. The primary differences are that you have to have two different types of proof of Missouri residency, and the homeless status form does not meet that burden, so you can't use that. And then you have to have a Social Security card every time you apply for it. So you can't just recite it, you have to show it. So for that reason, the non-real ID is the most accessible document for most of the people we serve. We don't prevent people from getting a real ID. We try to share the information. We share and explain the differences. And if folks have it and have what they need to get it, by all means, go for it. I just want to make one other quick note about a non-driver ID and the driver's license. And Bethany, I don't even know Bethany. Betsy already mentioned, but you can't use the certificate of homeless status for a driver's license. So because it's an exception document, then driving is a privilege and you can't use an exception to get a privilege, something like that. They tried to explain it at one point. So there are real and non-real, driver and non-driver, and then differences for documentation and homeless status. I've talked a lot about free ID to vote, so I won't spend too much more time there, but the eligibility requirements as mandated by state law is that you have to be 18 years or older. You cannot currently be on probation or parole. If you have been and it's been concluded, that's okay, you're eligible. And you cannot have a felony conviction related to voting, which like literally no one ever does. So if you meet those requirements and you have never had a free ID before, then you can get one. You can go, as I mentioned before, either online through the Secretary of State's website or in office. If you go online, it's one individual that serves all of the state of Missouri, and there will be a back and forth process of they mail you things, you mail them back, and ultimately you will have to still go to the DMV in order to get your free ID. I did mention previously the challenges. This came from a survey. So at the State ID Access Coalition, we called over 116 offices, DMV license offices in the state, and asked if they're using this program, if I could use it, what their answers were, and recorded them. So of the 100 and some odd that we called, 51% said, yes, we know about the free ID program and we're using it. The other 49% said either no, we don't know about it, or we're not doing it, or said yes, but not in all cases. So that would mean like, well, yeah, but not for a duplicate ID. Yeah, but not if blah, blah, blah. Or yeah, maybe, but they have to make a good case that they deserve it. Even that sort of thing was said. So we know there's huge variance here, but what my big takeaway here is that half of the license offices aren't issuing free IDs to vote on a regular and consistent basis in compliance with state law. Betsy?
So I mentioned that we do provide some support for Social Security card replacements, not a whole lot. And that in part, that's because there's no cost for it. So we don't need to provide any financial assistance for that. We do provide some logistical assistance. We provide some information and give some folks options on where the closest, usually, Social Security offices are. And then I will say there have been a couple of situations where somebody, as I mentioned, is caught in this catch-22, where we might provide a little bit more support and guidance for obtaining a replacement Social Security card. I have also called Social Security office a few times to ask about what might be a legitimate documentation to prove identity if they're really having issues with getting a photo ID. They just don't have it. And there are a couple of workarounds that we have found. So we do help our guests with that. Most of the time it is, here's the information, go forth. And then sometimes we do provide a little bit more assistance as needed with that.
Okay, we made it through the heavy part. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute in case there are questions about what we've covered so far, and then we just have 2 or 3 minutes to wrap up. It was a lot. Yeah, come off mute. Let's do it.
Hi.
Hi.
And I know I joined late, so you might have said this in the beginning, but I noticed that you're talking about doing these on Thursdays.
Yeah.
Are the hours afternoon? Because I've got a commitment every Thursday morning. I mean,
Yep. So right now we our photo ID schedule is online, but our regular clinic is on Thursdays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So the volunteer shifts are usually 10 to noon and noon to 2.
okay, so noon to 2. Okay.
But there are also some that we're adding. There's an occasional weekend, there's an occasional evening. We do offsite clinics on occasion. So we're doing one on Wednesday next week. So there are some maybe other opportunities. And
Okay,
I'll
so
also
go to
say,
the website. So go
yeah,
to the website.
and I'll send it up in the follow-up email so that
Okay.
you have the direct link. But if you're eager, it should be readily available on the website so that you can find it. And we'll talk about like the next place to plug in there after this.
Okay.
So how long does it take to actually like get competent at doing this?
I would say, and Betsy, maybe you want to answer differently. I would say it's really up to you in some ways. So our process, and I have a slide for it, but I'll go ahead and say it here. So our general process is come to a training or watch the recording. And this is going to finally update our recording because the last one online is from 2022. So then there's an orientation recording online. It's much shorter. I'm going to re-record it hopefully this weekend so that I can update that as well. But even if you skip the orientation, the next step from this training is sign up for a shadow shift. So we encourage everyone to shadow a volunteer at least once. And most people feel like 2 or 3 times generally feels good.
Really?
And so you sit with someone. We've definitely had people come once and be like, great, I'm good to go. And so you sit with someone who's doing it, you go through the process, you get experience sort of flipping through the binder and writing all things down and figuring it all out. And then you can sign up for a shift to be an application support volunteer, like standalone. So we generally try not to say like, you must do it this many hours before you take your own shift. But I also want you to feel confident and not put you in a position where you're feeling frantic or uncertain or causing sort of more fear with the guests. I will say though, that even when you sign up for like an independent application support shift, you're not alone. We do this in community. We have 2 offices that are next door. They're like 2 old classrooms. And we set up tables. Betsy's there, I'm there, the other volunteers are there. It's a collaborative environment, even if you're there for the first time, like by yourself. So you're not expected to know everything. You're just expected to treat people with love and respect and compassion, and to be able to guide folks through this process and navigate getting answers to the questions that they have and that you need.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many people do you serve on a typical shift?
Betsy?
So I would say our numbers recently have been around 30, low 30s each week, but that's for 4 hours. So 15, and maybe one person will see 3 to 4 guests.
Okay.
We
Okay.
schedule we schedule every half hour, and we schedule like 5. So we have 5 application support stations. And so we schedule 5 appointments, give or take, every half hour. And so you'll have some people that will be like, here's my ID. I just need my birth certificate. And it literally takes like 6 minutes, and then you're done. And then you have other people that have never had anything and they don't have anything else. And you could be there for 2 hours trying to navigate all the things with just one person. So I would say we average about 30 minutes a guest, knowing that
Right.
sometimes it goes way longer than that.
Yeah. And I would say, I'll jump back to your last question. The other thing that I would add is that just as soon as a volunteer, and I'll say this was this is my experience. So I'll say, just as soon as I felt like I had it, it's comfortable, like I got this, right? Somebody walks in with a situation that is completely new to me. And so, you know, there's always learning. So there's certainly a learning curve. And then when our volunteers kind of get up that curve, then every once in a while there's a new thing that comes. There was something new for me last Thursday. Last Thursday was yesterday. So there was something new for me yesterday that I learned, and I've been doing this a little bit over a year. So it was something I hadn't encountered before. And so, you know, now I'm just more knowledgeable in that particular aspect and can help help a volunteer who might face that type of situation down the road. So there's always learning. Well, I think you as a volunteer can, you know, get 80% of the cases and the situations kind of down because they're kind of routine. And there's going to be one that's just really very, very different. But that's why we're there. That's why Sarah's there. I'm there. The other volunteers are there. As Sarah mentioned, none of our volunteers are really just out there on their own.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let me pop back into the slides. I'm trying to keep us on time here, but happy to stay on if we need to do more questions. So just wanted to share very briefly what we've done to date, how we've served. So as I mentioned, we started our first clinic in August of 2022. This data goes through the end of last year. We served just shy of 1,000 people. And now we have served over 1,000. About 55% of the people we see are male, and the overwhelming majority of folks that we see identify as Black, African American, or something else that is not white or Caucasian. And I know that there are problems and challenges to categorizing race and ethnicity in that way, but I'm trying to make it succinct for this program, for this presentation, just to show it. In terms of housing instability, about 44% of all of the guests that we have seen identify as housing unstable. Within that, about 34%, so like a third of the unhoused guests that we see, get their ID because they use that homeless status form, the 5862. What that means is the other 2/3 of unhoused guests are already working with a shelter or a service provider that either does form 5862 for them or can provide some other proof of residency for them. Or at times they have an old address or a old place where they get mail and can prove residency that way in a way that meets the state's burdens. We have paid for almost 800 Missouri birth certificates, a little over 150 out-of-state birth certificates, and a little more than 680 Missouri photo IDs. I wanted to briefly mention that we are part of the Missouri State ID Access Coalition. I think doing this direct work has certainly opened my mind and my eyes about what these barriers are. And it has sort of fueled my fire for trying to do things at a systems level. It doesn't matter how many volunteers we train and how much money we pour into this. We are not going to catch everyone. We are not going to make sure that everyone has what they need to thrive if we're only doing it at an individual program level. So for me, that fuels my desire and our organizational commitment to address the systems in Missouri. And we are primarily doing that through the State ID Access Coalition. It's a really great space of folks across the state that are somehow related to ID access. Most are service providers, but not everyone. Some are advocates. Some came through like Missouri Voter Protection Coalition or League of Women's Voters and are really looking at this through the lens of voting and voter access. But we're all trying to chip away at how do we make sure that if the state is saying, you need an ID to do all of these things, that everyone then has an ID. Last year, we were awarded a 3-year grant from Missouri Foundation for Health that is supporting the ID Access Coalition. We are currently hiring a full-time coalition coordinator for the first time. We are sub-granting. This year, we are giving out $50,000 to support direct ID access programs across the state. So there's tons of more information about the coalition. I would welcome and encourage anyone to show up to the monthly meetings. We meet on Zoom. We'll be having a statewide conference, our first one, later this year. So more to come there, and another great place to plug in, especially if you're like, I'm here for the program stuff, but like, give me a chance to get at Jeff City and change this stuff. Go upstream. I'm here for it. Come to the coalition. Next steps. I think we already mentioned this, but I'm going to say it one more time. We have weekly clinics, as we mentioned, on Thursdays, off-site clinics. So come volunteer with us. Even if you're not sold that this is like your jam and you're totally going to show up and do this every week, that's okay. Come do it once. See what it's like. See how it feels. Meet the people that we get to meet. And I think many of our volunteers and guests express, not to be like totally cheesy, but like it is a community feel that feels different. We get to meet each other in ways that we haven't or maybe regularly won't. And we do it so intentionally in ways that is just accepting and inclusive, and it feels good. And it feels good to be part of it, and it feels good to receive it both ways. There was a gentleman there just yesterday who is having a really hard time. And before he left, he said, hey, I noticed you were out of sugar by the coffee, and I had a few extra sugar packets, so I just left them in there. Do you think that's okay? And like, yeah, of course it's okay. Like just that idea of like giving when you don't have anything to give and being so grateful to receive, it's really a mutual space there. We have other volunteer opportunities related to this project. When we do the Form 5862 and receive someone's ID on their behalf, that is usually people who are really having a hard time, and that coming back to our office might be a barrier. So we have established a delivery team and a pickup team that kind of works on an as needed basis. So if you're like, you know what? Yeah, I would meet people at your office at the hub during regular daytime hours. If you just need a body there so they can come pick up their ID, I would do that. That's a place where you can plug in. If you're like, you know what? There's a couple that came a couple weeks ago. We're like, we were driving. My husband would go with me anywhere. Like, we can deliver someone's IDs and we're always together. So like, great. Then you would work with us and work with a guest, and you would be able to meet them somewhere. There's a little training online for that, a recorded training, online that you can watch to find out more about that. On occasion, we have some needs for data entry, which can be remote work. So if you're interested, let us know. Again, that's on an as needed basis. I would love your help with the hospitality team. We are developing, and I have some photos online, but I will try to add some more on there. And there's a link on the next screen here. We have a hospitality corner so that we can give as much as we can. So we know 40% of the people that we see are unhoused. Sometimes people are hungry and they don't know where the next food is going to come from. And so no, granola bars aren't changing the world, but my God, it feels good to eat when you haven't eaten. And so we are having a wish list for the hospitality room. We just got some donations last week, but Betsy mentioned hats and gloves. We also have some toiletries, some personal care items, a variety of food. We have hot chocolate, tea, and coffee. Like, it's just little things where you feel like a person in a space that you often maybe don't. So we would love your support with that. I would, as I mentioned, invite you all to consider joining, at least coming to visit virtually the Missouri State ID Access Coalition. I will send all this out by email, but links are also available on our website. You can also sign up to be an election protection volunteer. This is a big election year. And so we want to make sure that folks know what their voting rights are and can access the polls in accordance with those rights. So protectthevote.net is a great way to get involved there. There are lots of opportunities for advocacy, including if you're watching this live or within 2 days on January 30th, the Ashray Foundation is taking a 15-passenger van driven by yours truly to the state capitol as part of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and Will of the People Advocacy Day. We'll be talking about protecting democracy and the initiative petition. So if you are watching this in time, please sign up, come with me to Jefferson City. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to be experienced. We've got 2 hours in the car on the way there, and there's some recorded trainings online, so you'll be good to go. But it will be great. And if you're watching this after that point, or right now and can't make it on Tuesday, there will be other times. So please come to Jefferson City with me and talk to folks about what they're doing and how it's impacting our community. Please, of course, show up to vote. This year, all the years, all the elections, it doesn't matter how small, it doesn't matter who you are or where you stand. Your opinion and your voice and your vote truly matters to me and to Ashray and to the work that we're doing. So please vote and take someone with you. And my last request is please, please, please tell 3 people about something that you learned today. Even if you were like, that girl's a little bit cray-cray and she's kind of wild, but she said some stuff about IDs that I need to go read more about. I'm cool with that. But please tell someone about this. Please change the way we're talking about IDs. You can pause the video now if you're watching a recording. You can grab your camera now or know that I will send this out in a follow-up, but you can scan these QR codes with your phone and they'll take you to some specific websites where you can sign up to receive emails from Ashray. You can see our upcoming events. You can stock the hospitality room. We have an Amazon wish list. We have a list of items so you don't have to shop on Amazon. Really, if you have it and you're willing to give it, we will help give it to people who need it. And finally, we are a nonprofit and we are primarily funded by private donations. So if you would like to donate to support our cause, we would appreciate it. Please consider a recurring gift at $33 a month, which covers the cost of 1 ID and 1 Missouri birth certificate. With that, I will end. We will stop screen sharing. We'll stop the recording. And if you have any questions, you can stay on just for a moment.